We started off as a cancer genetics company. When we're a completely different business today, we do have some investors who are not that involved at all, not that interested anymore in us, because their initial underwriting thesis, that thing they underwrote actually did not work. But then there are others that actually follow the entrepreneurial journey, right? Product and technology are an edge, but it is not in the top 3 priorities of the things that are going to make you succeed in healthcare. And so you need to be ready for that. You need to be ready to really get deep into the market, how doctors work and think, the clinical dimensions of it, and so on.
Every pivot is like you have to get your board aligned. You have to have enough money to be able to execute on the pivot. You have to have the right team, which means you have to shed certain people. Like every pivot is hard, and you've done it 3 times.
We kept it very simple.
So you left money on the table.
We left a lot of money on the table, but also left a lot of costs on the table too.
Welcome to an old friend of mine, Othman Laraki, to the podcast. He and I have been thinking for a while that we need to do a show together because his company, Color, has been through so many different iterations since I've known him. It's just such a classic example of a lifer company and also a lifer founder to the very core. So really happy to have him on. And, one of the things that I love most about his background is that he actually has a technology background as well as a healthcare one. So I wanted to ask him a question about a company that is very much on the top of my mind today, and that is Figma, to kick us off. And it has nothing to do with healthcare. But the reason I'm asking him about it is because Figma went public today. And most people don't know this, but this company has been around since 2012. And if you read the VC Sarah Go's really fantastic write-up of some of the early days, it took Figma 4 years to even produce an alpha version of the product. And I don't think anybody back in the early days would have thought that Figma was going to be the now $46 billion valued company that it is. So again, it's in a different industry, but it just goes to show that sometimes you need to bet on the tortoise and not the hare. So Othman, tell us a little bit about your own background, and then I would love your own thoughts on this Figma IPO, given your own background in tech.
Well, Chrissy, thanks for having me. It's great to see you after all this time. I feel like it shouldn't have taken getting on a podcast for us to catch up, but I'm glad that I'm seeing you now. In terms of background, like you mentioned, my background was primarily software and technology. I started a few software companies, was an early product manager at Google. There worked on a bunch of different products, including a lot of early client-side software. So the Google Toolbar, which some older people might remember, and then the project that became Google Chrome. So did a lot of work on that kind of how do you make Google search accessible and more directly available to a broader population. Later started a company that was one of Twitter's first acquisitions, and there I ran about half of the product team and started Color about 13 or 12 years ago, right around when Figma got founded. Actually, I was at dinner with Dylan just last week. It's fascinating, I think, to think about one of the patterns that keeps happening. First of all, to your point, a lot of these things people jokingly say the overnight success that took a decade. It's not just a health. I think
a decade would be fast. Yeah, we're talking 2 decades.
And I feel like in healthcare, that's almost like seen as a fast turn.
Yeah, it is.
Even in tech, like I think it does, really consequential companies, it takes a while. And at times like this, where, we're seeing AI companies get to 100 million ARR in like 6 months, et cetera. I think we get sometimes this skewed kind of recency bias there, but like it just takes a while to figure out a great business. More often than not, things that seem like a relatively, narrow or simple feature turn out to be like massively scalable and valuable to a very big group of people, right? Like Figma is an example, even like Google and Google search, right? When Google was founded, the consensus was like you needed to be a big portal. Like there was the era of AOL and Yahoo and Excite, et cetera. We had all these companies that had 100 different features, right? And search was almost kind of this side dish that no one really valued, but it turned out that was the main business engine. And I think with Figma, it's kind of similar, especially, I think the connection now with the AI era. I used to jokingly say one day we're going to invent the PowerPoint compiler. And whenever I'd be working on some new startup idea, I'd be like, you'd make some PowerPoint or like an outline, and it'd be nice to have a compile button that, just builds it for you. And at the time, we used to say it literally as a joke. And now we actually have that. And something like Figma, it is the level of expressiveness it gives to such a big group of people. And now that expressiveness can turn into one step closer to reality with all the AI tools. And looking back, they weren't allowed to get acquired by Adobe. But I think now they're probably like half of Adobe's market cap. In some ways, it's the top end of the distribution. It's almost like a power law, right? Like it's the things that really work are just massive and they become the behemoths of the next cycle. It's really hard to guess which ones those are going to end up being. But, and like you said, like it's oftentimes a very tortuous or torturous, depending on perspective, path.
Yeah, I'm curious for your thoughts on what it says about venture because, reading that it took them 4 years to build really a product they could take to market. And then for a lot of that time, they were burning 800 grand a month. And so I would think that any VC at that moment would have been like, this company is a disaster. It is setting our money on fire. But part of it, and I think part of being a VC is that you just really have to like actually just take on this asymmetric risk. And you got to invest in things that, maybe really are not going to be generational companies for a very long time and take on that risk. And I wonder if we have gotten to a place of complacency where VCs increasingly are not looking to take on any risk whatsoever. They don't want regulatory risk. They don't want technology risk. They want things that they can get up and running very quickly that start spitting out revenue and now increasingly moving to profitability much faster. What do you think is going on here with just risk appetites? And is venture moving away from the very thing that it was created to do?
I think that also is actually quite cyclical because by now I've been through a few boom bust cycles and kind of seen a few of these. I think even venture in itself is as dynamic as the startup industry, I feel. Because what happens is when everyone kind of says the same marketing, the same BS, we all wrap up the thing in like this great aspirational statements about how we invest in like, et cetera. But like when you peel back, sometimes it's at a fund level, but even the individuals within funds, there's a question of like, when you take out all of the, nice language, what are you truly underwriting? And that sometimes is the most important because sometimes some people are underwriting a specific idea and because they're excited about that, but not a lot of other things. And more often than not, like that initial idea
changes. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing you underwrote might have changed. And that's okay. I understand that from an investor side when you're not as excited anymore because the thing you underwrote didn't play out, but you're kind of locked in. There are others that are like, they'll underwrite a cycle in some sense. They're like, I just believe we're in this important era and I want to make a bunch of choices, but directionally, I want to be kind of heavily involved in this. Others are more like they'll fundamentally underwrite an individual and a team and are ready to follow them through stuff. Even for example, with color, right? Like, it's been a 12-year journey so far. And, we have some of our investors, they underwrote the genesis of the company because we started off as a cancer genetics company when we're a completely different business today. And, we do have some investors who, are not that involved at all, not that interested anymore in us because their initial underwriting thesis, like that thing they underwrote, like actually did not work. But then there are others that follow the entrepreneurial journey and, really kind of roll with you through the iterations. And I can't, honestly, like, I don't know if there's like a right or wrong. I think there's different places for things. But I think in big hype cycles like we are right now, one of the big separations that happens is that proverbial 2% and 20% investors. Are you investing for the 20%, which means like, the carry, or are you optimizing to get the home runs and the world changing companies? And that is fundamentally what you're trying to do day in and day out. When there's a big hype cycle, there's also just like a lot of capital that rushes in. And so it's also very profitable for a venture firm to play the 2% game, which is just try to have much capital under management, right? And
yeah, management fees.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if most of the companies end up blowing up. You've made $1 billion along the way. So you're much more of almost like like more of an asset manager, not a true risk oriented venture investor. You're not personally aligned with the risk, right? So
chasing short-term success versus long-term, which can look like markups. Like anytime a company is valued higher than what you put into it, that's a win if you're an asset manager. But, you see a lot of these companies go public now, and we started to see some of them in health tech and folks that just wrote up, like a lot of people didn't make money who just like wrote the valuation higher and higher. And which just goes to show it's like price is very meaningful. Price is everything in terms of whether or not you can really make money on some of these deals. And if you're just chasing the hype, if you're chasing what's hot, then chances are you're paying a very high price. And maybe that looks good in the short term because you could tell your investors that you were in this hot deal. But in the long run, are you going to make money from that? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think from a pure financial return standpoint, I think those are all actually quite rational behaviors or paths, right? Like it's kind of like I don't think it's irrational. It's just a choice of where each person wants to invest their time in their life and what they're in it for. With healthcare, it's not a part of the economy where you generate very high multiples, at least as of today, right? Like it's gone through hype cycles where the multiples have gone up, went through short periods where they're pretty high, but the fundamental game that you play in healthcare, I think is just, you're playing with harder game settings, right? Like it's kind of, you're playing the hard mode in a way, but the returns are just, it's a different return profile, right? Like I think from a both financial, but also impact standpoint, right? Like, you do have what is the value of literally having people emailing you about how you saved their life or the life of a family member or things like that. And so in some ways, I think it takes all of those parts, to cover the board. Like, there are many different ways to, that gets covered. And in some ways, I think that's one of the beauty of the, American environment is like that free market allows all of that surface area to be touched on in a way.
Yeah, it's also why and I want to get on to the color story, but one of the things I feel is really unique about healthcare is how many people in it are post-financial. I meet people all the time that are founding companies that have already had big exits. And the only reason is because of the mission. It's one of the few areas that you get to have that kind of impact on somebody's life. And so I think it attracts like a certain type. And it's also a terrible place to be, in my opinion, if you just are looking to make some money really quickly. I think that I would really encourage maybe Bitcoin or something like that over being in healthcare. I don't know how you feel about that. Do you agree? It's it seems to be, there's a certain type that wants to spend time in this space.
Yeah, I mean, especially because of my background and even like today, I still try to help a lot of companies, not just in healthcare. I see on a weekly basis, friends and other entrepreneurs who are wanting to do something in healthcare. And because it is 20% of the economy, it's a huge, massive market, and also a place where there's the biggest untapped opportunity, even broad economics wise. If you think about the opportunity as the delta between how much is spent and the value we're getting and the free market opportunity to close that gap, healthcare is literally where there's the biggest gap, I think, of any part of the economy and the total dollars of gap. But the clock speed of healthcare, not just because of regulation, by the way, I think a lot of people think it's because of FDA and the regulation piece. I don't think it's actually that. I think it's much more the market structure that's more the biggest driver of that clock speed. And so, especially when I see entrepreneurs who are like me, just tech nerds who love the things that intellectually get me the most excited, like the underlying technology. And the warning I give all of them is product and technology are an edge, but it is not in the top three priorities of the things that are going to make you succeed in healthcare. And so you need to be ready for that. You need to be ready to really get deep into the market, how doctors work and think, the clinical dimensions of it, and so on. Oftentimes I see people come from tech who see oh, it's a data problem. And, it's oh, I'm going to make this analytics thing that's going to or even now with AI, right? People are oh, it's going to throw an LLM on it and it's going to magically solve healthcare. It's actually, you need to go deep into the subject matter. And there are very few pure technical solves in healthcare. Whereas, take Figma, back to the Figma example, they've done a lot of things that are very smart at the industry level, but fundamentally, I think they won because they just built a great product, right? Or other companies, whether it's Canva or Instagram or et cetera, it's the product that you built, the software is 90% of why you win. Even in a lot of back-end infrastructure, like a complex Snowflake, et cetera. Whereas in healthcare, you fundamentally have to solve true healthcare problems in most cases, right?
Just having a great product isn't enough. You got to have more.
Yeah.
It's incentives too. It's I think a lot about the opportunity around, just as one example, remote patient monitoring. And I was talking to a friend this morning about this, we used to work in a big health system in a senior role. And that technology makes so much rational sense that, like, of course we would use technology to monitor people from home between visits and whatnot, but like go to a health system and the CFO will tell you remote patient monitoring is not on the agenda, not on the cards for them, because it means one less head in a bed. And that's how you make money if you are a CFO of a big health system. It's just grappling with some of those realities that it does not matter how much it makes sense. And you could even say it makes sense from a perspective of it could save money and all kinds of great things. It's better for the patient, but you have to understand the incentives, and it's not just one customer, it's all of them. And sometimes they are directly competing. And I think those are the things that sometimes trip up so many founders that, you and I have both seen and lived.
Hey everyone, we'll get right back to the conversation after a word from our sponsors. Today's sponsor is Granola. Granola is the AI notepad for people in back-to-back meetings. That is me. I've been using Granola for about a year now, and honestly, it's one of the tools that has changed the way I work. Granola takes meeting notes for me without any intrusive bots joining pitch meetings, interviews, and other calls. And the notes are just fantastic. To show you how good they are, I'm going to be running Granola during today's podcast and sharing the notes with all of you. Once you try it on a first meeting, it's hard to go without. Head to granola.ai/lifers and use the code LIFERS to try it out for yourself.
I do want to get into your story because we met, probably like almost 15 years ago, maybe 10, but like it was when you were just starting the business. And you mentioned it was in cancer genomics. You were more in the diagnostics area, doing a lot of testing and whatnot. So that was like V1. And then I saw you get into during COVID. You were the company that was doing all the COVID tests. I'm sure that was an opportunity both to, react to what was needed at the time, but then there's also a lot of revenue that you can generate in that period of time. And there are a number of companies that kind of popped over COVID. And then now I see you playing much more in a very different area, which is within back to cancer, but much more focused on employers and health plans and kind of really supporting people through a cancer diagnosis and the aftermath of that. And so this is it's been a long, you've had at least 3 pivots that I'm aware of. Maybe there were more, but, I'd love to hear about just the journey, like walk me through that. And also how you were able to, because every pivot is so, like you have to get your board aligned. You have to have enough money to be able to execute on the pivot. You have to have the right team, which means you have to shed certain people. Like every pivot is hard and you've done it 3 times. So I'd love to hear anything you can share about kind of that journey.
Yeah. So on the first generation of the company, where we started off was, in some ways like very specific and narrow, which was like, we're in the cancer genetics space. And at the time, genetics was getting much less expensive and we felt that it could be brought to large populations. One of the core common threads that actually connects to all of them was that from the beginning with Color, we felt that a lot of aspects of healthcare where you're dealing with relatively straightforward like experiences or experiences that could become straightforward if you use technology to just make the cost much lower and connect it around the patient as opposed to the layers of healthcare. What I mean by that is like you have the doctor that's separate from the lab, that's separate from the genetic counselor, that may be separate from where you get follow-up care and so on. Even with our first genetics product, we integrated all those and dropped the costs a lot. And that really put a muscle into the company of being very full stack and realizing you can deliver a much more cost-effective experience. So at the time, like doing a basic cancer genetics test used to cost about $5,000. And we did it at $250 at equal or better quality by connecting all the pieces together and not dealing with all the kind of like overhead of billing and the kind of like friction that like, cost most of the money. And that, I think, on one hand, we realized over time, like the biggest cost actually was not doing the testing, but doing the go to market, where it's like having a clinical sales team, the RCM, like dealing with reimbursement, et cetera. That was actually
God. RCM, I remember my first experiences of venture, just looking at the cost of all this stuff. And it's so much money for any of these companies. It's crazy. And now it's coming down a little bit thanks to AI, but it's insane how much complexity there is just to billing.
Yeah. So our first kind of turn was realizing, hey, we really care and we think we can do really good work doing population level work. And we think that's actually very differentiating. But in order to do that successfully, you cannot be loading in hundreds of dollars of cost per transaction. If it costs $200 to collect, You can't have something that costs $250, right? That was the first kind of pivot of recognizing that and just being lucid about it and being like, okay, like we need to change our tune. So we started orienting around like, can we figure out like large populations that we can work with in bulk? So we started working with the NIH on a very large, that's actually still running. It's a study called the All of Us program. It's the biggest research study in the world that's like over 1 million people across the US. And we became over time the core infrastructure for it. And that kind of set us up actually for when COVID happened. There was initially, I mean, we were not thinking of it as a business. It was like literally, okay, there's this huge kind of national emergency. And most people were focused on the technology of like, oh, this new magical test is going to solve everything. New vaccines are coming, and excited about the tests or the vaccines or the medications like Paxlovid. But everyone was discounting how important access and distribution were. You can make the best test in the world, but if it's not easy to access and distribute to large populations, that doesn't work. And it turned out that we had like the perfect infrastructure to deliver these big national programs. So we served almost 8 million people, about 35 to 40 million tests. We actually were doing a lot of like millions of vaccines. So for example, in California, like especially doing vaccines for underserved communities, like, Black communities in churches, et cetera. Like, so we were one of the biggest like vaccine infrastructure providers in the country. About 3/4 of the test to treat Paxlovid programs that run by states started to go through us. And at the core of everything we were doing was like the great software workflows, integrating the doctor, the test, and the patient together into like a connected experience. And what that allowed us to do is actually we were always the most cost-effective provider for all of these across the board. And we're able just kind of to serve the public in an amazing and meaningful way, and ran over 13,000 sites across the country. So it was like, it was an amazing opportunity to serve and to, have an impact.
So before we get into the next chapter, I do want to ask a question that, because a lot of people, we think back to that time and like your company definitely was, I remember, like it was one of the big players on the scene for access to tests and vaccines and whatnot. But there were other companies as well that had really exploded at that moment. And a lot of them raised money, substantial amounts of money at the time to, just because they had so much, they would just say, we have hundreds of millions of dollars of revenues and we are, profitable, and look what we've done with our response to this national emergency, and then went out of business shortly thereafter because, there was only a moment in time where everybody wanted to get COVID tests. I don't even think anybody has them anymore except those who continue to be worried about it. Maybe they have a immune system challenge or whatnot, but a lot of people are not testing now at all. And so those companies died. I think, a good example is Q, but you all did not. You didn't die. You instead moved in a new direction. So did you have discussions like as a team, like, should we keep going with this and be like this premier kind of diagnostics testing business? Like maybe COVID is going to enter us into this new era where people want to test for all sorts of things and be way more vigilant about their health. And we could raise a bunch of money off of that, or we could invest a bunch of the money that we just made. Like, what made you say, no, we're going to go invest these funds into doing something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of credit for us navigating that well goes to Caroline Sabello, who's Colors president, who you probably you've met her a few times as well. When I look back, I think we did a few things well. From the beginning, we felt it was very likely that the entire COVID cycle was going to be a relatively ephemeral window of time. And so we were pretty lucid about like, one thing that was amazing during COVID is like, all of the purchasing was made directly by the beneficiaries, big employers, school systems, unions, government programs, as opposed to being mediated through insurance. I think a lot of people who did COVID work, an easy way to make a lot of money on COVID was to actually bill through insurance. And I won't say which plan, but one of the CEOs of one of the plans in the country showed me the distribution of how much people were charging them for COVID tests. And it was like a median of like $500 per test. Whereas our median price was like $50 or $60. But part of that was like, we never billed through insurance. You could just buy direct from us if you want to do a big program, and that's it. And so we kept it very simple.
So you left money on the table.
we left a lot of money on the table, but also left a lot of costs on the table too, right? We're not interested in the kind of like gouging insurance companies, and like we want to do things at scale. And if there's the need, and if there isn't, that's okay. We don't need to be doing this. I think that was a reflex that helped us a lot. Number two is that knowing it was ephemeral, instead of going and building a lot of infrastructure, we run a pretty large scale lab at Color, but we considered building a lab and we were offered funding to build labs that were like 10 times the size. But then that asset becomes a liability. Like it's really hard to be running a lab that can do 500,000 or 250,000 samples a day. And then if the demand stops, all of a sudden, even you can go from generating a lot of cash to just like burning a huge amount of cash with very little flexibility to get out of it, right? Like you have real estate, you have huge employee base, et cetera. So what we did around that is we were like, a lot of people are going to be making the choice to build a lot of infrastructure. Instead of doing that, what we know how to do really well is access and the front end and the simplicity and distribution and logistics around that. And so we actually did a lot of partnerships. For example, the state of California built a massive lab in Southern California. We became the operating system for that entire infrastructure for the entire state. Thermo Fisher, we had a really big partnership with them where all of the thermo labs across the country that had capacity, or the Broad Institute in Massachusetts, all these places that built up a lot of capacity needed a market access, an efficient model to serve people with them. And that allowed us to do a lot of work, but also not be sitting on a huge asset base.
So that's interesting. So it's kind of like you were sort of a front end. Like you were the consumer accessible front end, which allowed the system to essentially be the infrastructure provider.
And also clinical infrastructure for the government or for institutions, for clinicians, right? When people are buying these things, they don't want to buy individual tests. They want to buy, an outcome, right? They want to ensure that I don't have a breakout in my university or whatnot, right?
Yeah.
That's what we focused on. And the third piece, I think that was super important, is that pretty early we were like, okay, we think we've crested, and there can be a long tail. It's like I jokingly said internally, I was like, nothing good happens at a party between midnight and 4 a.m. Like once it's midnight, it's time to leave. And so we were like, okay, the emergency's over. There's going to be this long tail of demand. We can keep trying to stick to it, but we're just like getting empty calories here. We're just wasting time. At this point, we're not really solving anyone's problem anymore because there is capacity. We exited COVID very early. In part, what informed that is I was also on the board of the American Cancer Society. And in the background, we were starting to hear from a lot of employers and et cetera, like this background drumbeat of cancer and the rise of cancer costs and younger people being diagnosed, and like this kind of like this arc of cancer was starting to see that signal. And for us, that was kind of almost like it also helped us. Like we were like, this is why we started the company in the first place. And now we have built this infrastructure, and thanks to COVID in a way, that enables us, instead of just thinking of it as a genetic test, we can build this thing that we would have never had the audacity to build before. And so that enabled us almost to kind of like skip off that rock and build this thing with the American Cancer Society that now is the full business of Color, which is if you were to build like a national cancer service, a national virtual cancer clinic, where would you start and how would you go about it? You wouldn't go and start buying buildings and building individual treatment centers. You would actually first start by building this kind of what we call virtual cancer clinic, which is how do you serve cancer patients or the need around cancer holistically from screening and prevention all the way through survivorship. That's what led us into the current, and I think I'm pretty confident, final chapter of the company, or at least final kind of like, from a product orientation standpoint, this vision is very real and connecting really well, which is it turns out that cancer is the number one cost driver in American healthcare, growing faster than any other area. And actually all the trend data is going to come out over September. And like the buzz I'm hearing from the background from everyone, the plan is going to be one of the biggest step ups in history. And cancer is at the leading end of that. And we currently don't have an integrated way to manage cancer across populations. We'd started to hear the early signs of that coming from unions, employers, pensions. And so that's when we decided to make that leap.
I do kind of recall that shift as well in the dialogues that I was having with employers as well, that it used to be all about diabetes, cardiovascular, MSK, musculoskeletal was a top 3 area. And then increasingly right around the end of the pandemic and subsequently, and I think a lot of that, and you'll have to tell me if I'm correct on this, I think part of that being the drop in kind of prevention and screening during the pandemic, that now we're seeing the aftermath of that, which is more cancer and in younger populations than we're used to seeing. But also the costs of treatment are going up, and we're starting to see cancer just become more and more expensive as you're getting these more sophisticated treatments coming to market that are also a lot more expensive. And so I think cancer to me is like this big complex thing. And I do wonder a lot about just the inequity piece of it too, because big companies that have gobs of money will have a lot to spend on patients that have, their employees, their members, whatever you want to call them, that get cancer, or family members. And then we have a lot of America now that's losing access to coverage, or they work at small businesses or mid-market employers that cannot afford to spend millions of dollars on cancer treatment. And so now you see a lot more effort, I think, being put on prevention. Could we catch it sooner and maybe it's cheaper? But I think all these trends seem to be converging all at once right now with cancer. And I agree with you, like all happened kind of right around the time of the pandemic and in the years to follow.
One category of that have worked really well and that have had a big impact is like when you take a step back, when you look at both spend as well as impact on people's lives, there's kind of like 5 or so big rocks, right? Like it's kind of cancer, cardiometabolic health, mental health, fertility and pregnancy, and musculoskeletal. Like those 5 are probably like something like 80% of spend, but also when one of those categories is highly relevant to an individual, like if you're pregnant or if you're a cancer patient, that becomes your entire health, like center of mass, your core identity. You might have high blood pressure, but if you're a cancer patient, like that is the thing.
Oh, 100%. I think I've told you this, but I have this little mental chart that I've built in my head. It's like you have acuity on the one hand, then you have on the other hand cost. And the third bucket that you have to look at is natural levels of engagement. I wish I had a better term for it, but it's like pregnancy. If you have a complicated pregnancy, you are up there on all 3. Cancer is the only other one I can think of that's like all ticks every single box. Maybe GI, if it's like a complex GI condition. But a lot of other stuff is like, it may be high cost and it may be expensive, but it is so hard to get people to like really engage, because it's like there are certain conditions that will kill you very slowly. I mean, it's not good. Your outcomes are not good, but it tends to be a much slower progression. Whereas cancer is like, you hear the C word and you drop everything. That is, you're rushing to find the best treatment that you possibly can, do everything that you can. So I think it makes it a really interesting opportunity for a digital solution that, maybe you can afford to be, less kind of in person, because you have that patient that has that super urgent need to find you.
Most of the realization too is that there's a cost side, both to the system and to the individuals, right? We all focus on how much it costs to the plans, but about 40 or so % of cancer patients will lose their entire life savings within the first 2 years of a diagnosis. And so it's kind of like this very deep, beyond the health impact, also kind of like the financial impact, et cetera. But one of the things we realized that was kind of a core thesis of a lot of our work is that there's oftentimes a lot of excitement about novel therapies or like some super new, like great diagnostics, like for example, the multi-cancer blood detection products, et cetera, and assuming that those are going to be the magic pills that are going to solve everything. But when you actually unpack it, it turns out that even with the tools we already have today and what's already in guidelines, et cetera, the level of like, because it's partially incentives, but like we heavily underutilize and undermanage the places that are the low-hanging fruit in terms of impact. And that causes all of the spend to be in the high cost, but not very effective. When you look at the last 20 years, and cancer mortality has gone down overall, but that's not because of the late-stage cancer therapies, where late-stage lung cancer is almost as deadly today as it was 20 years ago. There are a few like specific exceptions, but by and large, that has not gone that much better. What has gone better is that early-stage cancers are eminently survivable. An early-stage breast cancer has like a 60th mortality of a late stage breast cancer, right? And so that is a huge progress. And we already have tools that can make a big difference, right? Like if you look at lung cancer, it's the biggest mortality driver in the US today. And only 6% of all the people who should get a lung cancer screen get it today. And for a population that is compliant with lung cancer screening, the survival rate goes from 14% to about 45%. That's like a bigger effect than any cancer drug that has ever been introduced in the history of cancer, right? Like, and that's using a low dose CT that's super cheap.
People are terrible about getting lung cancer screenings. It's like by the way, I live in Queens, and there is like literally a smoke shop on every single corner now. And I have even seen, I kid you not, ads to get people smoking again, saying smoking is cool all over Queens. And people are just do not get lung cancer screening. So like, I hear you on, you got to get diagnosed as soon as possible, but like, how do you change behavior?
It turns out, like, so the thing is that it's literally access. It's back to the stuff we've learned on the internet. You make things simple. The easiest way to make someone do something is not to scare them, is not to pay them, is literally to take out the friction. So today we're actually increasing like screening rates by over 70% across the population we work with. And it's not, we do something magical. It's like we just make it incredibly easy. It's like you answer a couple questions. You need to get a lung CT. Like the order goes, we schedule everything. We tell you where to go. The results come back. Our clinicians do the follow up, et cetera. Like it's all of those steps. Like here's another example for colon cancer screening. If you get a FIT test today, a lot of people get a positive FIT test. They get scheduled for colonoscopy 6 months later. If you're one of the 10% of people who actually have colon cancer, one of the positive FIT tests, your colon cancer is not going to be hanging out and waiting for you. What we do is we just reschedule them to be within 10 days. It's just having an integrated model. That's why like that we bet on that vertical integration. Is like when you vertically integrate the doctor, the imaging, the follow-ups, et cetera, is that you can be very proactive about all these places where the impact is sitting, right? And so that was kind of like the big bet. And, we're already seeing like, very big impact from it, but it's
yeah. And I'm curious, like with the point on convenience, which I think is a really good one. I was talking to a couple of employers a few weeks ago, and they were like, yeah, we used to actually have huge success when we would just bring a nurse in to do a bunch of vaccinations. Like we'd offer a flu vaccine, and all you'd have to do is like walk from your office to like somewhere in an easy location, and people would just come. Like it was so easy. And now with all this like remote hybrid stuff, it's a little bit more challenging. But I wonder if you're seeing like in the return to office trend, are you finding new opportunities for like that level of convenience where you can just show up and recruit people on site or even do certain kinds of screenings on site?
Yeah, our strategy there's no one size fits all. There's like a bunch of different models that we kind of roll out at the same time, which is like for populations, for example, we work with one of the biggest transportation companies in the country. And obviously they're all very physical. And so we do things on site with them, and that gets huge take rate, especially for people who are like really kind of more the blue collar workforce, et cetera. It's much easier to intercept people in person. A lot of digital outreach is very effective for dependents who are often ignored or forgotten. But I think it's a very multi outreach strategy. But ultimately, it's kind of like, how do you ensure that you're not wasting anyone's time, right? If someone needs a colonoscopy, they should not be getting forced to have a doctor visit unnecessarily. Like you just need to understand whether they need a colonoscopy. Great. Where do you want to go? Here are a few options. Let's get you scheduled. And if there's something that's found, that's kind of like someone needs to be on point to ensure that there's a follow-up and you follow guidelines and so on. And so, but yeah, I think the on-site piece is actually for people who are back, it's actually quite effective, but it's very extremely variable.
So I think we'd have so much more to talk about just on this topic of cancer. And I'm fascinated, but just in the thinking about like the theme of the pod, which is really around the idea of being a lifer. I would love to know, you've been in this for a long time now. You are now a healthcare person, as much as you are a tech person, I would argue. Maybe you disagree, but I think you speak both languages now. What do you wish you had known? What advice would you have wish that you'd had when you were starting out in healthcare, somebody who'd worked at Twitter, which who knows what it's called now, and Google, coming into the space, like, and not, I would say, just in the interest of like our audience, like we've got a lot of operators listening, so we don't want pie in the sky feedback, like keep going. We want like something very tactical, something very specific. Like, what do you wish you had known?
One of the things that I feel I heavily underappreciated initially is taking the time to deeply understand the financials and economics of the different participants. For example, with payers, people talk about payers as like a single thing, but in reality, they have books of business, Medicare Advantage, exchange plans, etc., all of whom are quite different. And I think oftentimes if you're in the kind of services side of healthcare, as an entrepreneur, we tend to underestimate how much that drives a lot of decisions for people. The other piece of advice I give to a lot of folks is, especially if you're on the care, like on the clinical side, like, I mean, again, there's like the RCM, et cetera. That's, I think, very different side of the industry, but like go deep on the healthcare and clinical side. Like if you're in the cancer space, like I'm not an oncologist, obviously, but I really go deep and try to understand how cancer works, how patients' experiences are, et cetera. Sometimes in the early days of, I think, a lot of health tech startups, people stay very superficial. And sometimes that carries for years, right? Like, I find one of the archetypes of that are the navigation companies, where it all looks very simple. It's all about navigation. People are confused, and you're dealing with people with very specific and individual problems, and being able to understand the experience of a cancer patient and the clinical dimension of a cancer patient, or someone going through a cardiovascular problem, et cetera, I think is very important. And I feel the companies that, at least that I have the most respect for, and I think have done the best job, are the ones who've gone really deep in those. And that's kind of like, there are multiple verticals, right? Companies like Hinge and Sword, or Lyra and Spring, or Maven in women's health. Like I feel those have done a great job going deep and being specific to the people that they're actually trying to serve. And sometimes people don't take a long time to get there. And so that's at least one piece of advice.
And to the like tortoise and hare point that we were making about Figma, just to take us full circle, do you see this version of color as a public company someday?
I've been through a few IPOs. That step in itself is not that. I think it looks exciting until you go through it. In some ways, like life is just harder as a public company. And honestly, a lot of the aggressive changes we've made would have been so much harder to do as a public company. So I think I love preserving the ability to be very nimble. If it's a question about the scale of, and the kind of the financial or business scale of this space in the cancer vertical is one of the biggest kind of, both business as well as impact opportunities in American healthcare. So one answer is yes, like, it's kind of in terms of like, I don't view that as a goal in itself, but I do think like building the biggest virtual cancer clinic in the country is something that can be a very sizable business. And I think something that can both have like, I think a very sound financial profile, but, more importantly, frankly, is just seeing the impact we're having. I think that's I think it can really change the experience of so many people.
Well, on that note, excited for the future that you have to come and to continue to watch the company grow. Thank you so much for joining me on the pod.
No, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for telling the stories of so many interesting companies doing great work and
doing the hard stuff. Yeah, well, so much appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and just to hear a little bit about the story, because I think it just goes to show the power of the pivot and how necessary that can be as a healthcare business. And also that you got to believe in the team before anything, because betting on it or underwriting against a product that a company may pitch you on the pre-seed or seed, I think is very flawed, given how many times you see these companies just reacting to the moment, what they're seeing in the market. So I'm of the mindset that I'd rather back a founder all day long that can make quick decisions and pivot. So great kind of color on color. And just, I think, a good example of the importance of decisiveness with what's going on in the market. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time for more stories like this one.
That's a wrap on Lifers. If you know someone else grinding it out in healthcare, send them this episode. And if you want more unfiltered takes on digital health, check out the Second Opinion newsletter, link in the show notes.